The Train to Impossible Places. Chapter 3. The Impossible Postal Express. The last thing Susie saw before she hit the ground was a train erupting in a whirling mass of wheels, rods and pistons from the tunnel mouth. Then she screwed her eyes shut, and for a second the world was dark and full of noise. Hot steam gusted over her face. Metal screeched and clashed. A whistle howled. She gritted her teeth and clapped her hands over her ears. The scream of brakes reached a crescendo and suddenly died away. There was a last outrush of steam, like a sigh of relief, and everything went quiet. Susie risked opening one eye. She had fallen at the foot of Fletcher's tent, her feet just centimetres from the track. Rough hands grasped her shoulder, and she looked up to see Fletch standing over her, pulling her into a sitting position. She was too shocked to resist. "What were you thinking?" he said, hopping from foot to foot in agitation. "You almost became an incident." "A what?" she said, her ears still ringing. "An incident on the line. The worst type of incident it's possible to be." Susie looked at him blankly and wondered what to say. His tone made her want to apologise, but she wasn't sure he deserved it. In fact, didn't he still owe her an apology? She was just gathering up her thoughts to say so when a new voice called out from somewhere high above them. "Fletch! Is that you, old chap? What the dickens is going on down there?" They both looked up towards the source of the voice, and Susie almost fell backwards in surprise. A mighty old steam locomotive towered over her, hissing and shuddering and belching yellowish steam from its chimney. It was far bigger than any locomotive Susie had ever seen before. At least, bits of it were. To her eyes, it looked like a large train had smashed into several smaller ones, and maybe a few buildings along the way, and the parts had all got mixed up and stuck together. Its chimney was too wide, none of the drive wheels quite matched, and the cylindrical belly of its boiler was too fat at the front and too narrow at the back. The driver's cab was nothing less than a neat little red brick cottage, complete with tiled roof, window boxes, and a bright red front door, which stood open on the near side of the boiler. It was from here that the voice had come, and as Susie watched, a small figure scampered out of the cottage and onto a narrow gangway that ran along the length of the locomotive's flank, a metre or so above the wheels. The figure carried a lantern and shone his light directly down on Fletch, like a spotlight. "Fletch, we didn't just have an incident, did we?" Susie tried to make out the figure's face, but it was just a black patch of shadow behind the glare of the lantern. "It's worse than that, Stonker," said Fletch. "Look." He hooked a thumb in the direction of Susie, and the light swung over to cover her. "Good grief! A local! And it's awake!" "Looks like someone on the prep team messed up," said Fletch. "Who was on shift tonight?" "Not a soul, old chap," said Stonker. "Didn't you get the memo? They did it all remotely." "Pah!" Fletcher spat. "No wonder. What do I keep telling 'em? This remote spell business is all well and good, but you need people on the ground if you want the job done properly. I mean, it's just a sleeping spell. A common tooth fairy could do it." "Quite right, old boy, quite right," said Stonker, clearly distracted. "But given that it's here, what do you suggest we do with it? We're still behind schedule." Fletch scratched his scalp and looked Susie up and down. "I should put a call into HQ, I suppose. See if they can send someone to reset her memory." "Don't you dare," Susie said, jumping back. You can't go poking around inside my mind. It doesn't belong to you. It's probably for the best, the shadow figure of Stonker told her. We're not really supposed to be here, you see, outside our jurisdiction and all that, and it won't do to have you giving us away. Although, having said that, it might take HQ a while to get someone out here. Could you put on a spell on it yourself, Fletch? Fletch sucked his breath in through his teeth. I don't know, Stonks. Memory's a fiddly. It's like unknotting spiderwebs. You never know which bit's connected to what. Maybe I could do a confusion spell instead. No, you won't, said Susie, backing away. I'm confused enough as it is. She squinted into the circle of light, hiding Stonker. And I'm not an it. I'm a she, thank you very much. Female of the species, eh? Said Stonker. I'm afraid I'm not really well versed in the fauna of these parts. Do you have a name? I'm Susie, said Susie. Susie Smith, and I'd like to know who you are and what you're doing here, please. I suppose we do owe you the courtesy. The light bobbed and weaved as Stonker grappled with the lantern. Then it flickered out entirely. It took Susie a few seconds to blink away the green and red smudge it left on her vision. And then she saw him. He was the same sort of creature as Fletch, though his skin was a flinty grey and less warty and wrinkled. He wore a smart blue uniform, with a coat that reached his ankles and a peak cap with silver piping. He looked down at her past both his enormous nose and an equally impressive salt and pepper moustache, as thick and lustrous as a badger, which hung down almost to his knees, before the tips curled back up into rigid little spirals. His blue eyes twinkled as he spoke. J.F. Stonker, he said, driver of the Impossible Postal Express, the finest troll train on the rails. He reached up and gave the locomotive's boiler an affectionate pat. You're trolls, she said. How is that possible? We hadn't intended to stop, said Stonker, but I'm afraid you wandered onto the tracks. You're jolly lucky the brakes have just been serviced. But that wasn't my fault, said Susie, feeling the temperature rise in her cheeks. The tracks aren't supposed to be here. None of this is supposed to be here, including you. This was all starting to feel terribly unfair. Fear not, said Stonker. We'll be on our way again momentarily, and Fletch will have the tracks up and everything back to normal proportions in no time. You'll never know the difference. Normal proportions? For the first time, Susie realised there was a question she hadn't asked herself. How could such an enormous steam engine possibly fit inside her house? She looked up past the locomotive and saw the hall ceiling, impossibly high above her head. The purple light showed like a distant hot air balloon. The hall had grown to the size of a cathedral without her even noticing. What happened? She said, wide-eyed. What did you do? Not really my department, I'm afraid, said Stonker. Fletch here is the technical genius. Fletch sniffed. I try my best. Susie hardly heard them. She was running back and forth, trying to take it all in. The living room door was as tall as a cliff now, and she would have to stand on tiptoes if she wanted to reach the top of the skirting board. The kitchen door had vanished altogether, replaced by another enormous stone arch. The tracks didn't end there anymore, but ran on into the blank darkness beyond. Her voice echoed in the cavernous space as she cried, You shrank us! Nah, said Fletch, cocking his head to one side and plucking at the hairs in his ears. I just gave the hall a bit of a stretch, that's all. You mean you made everything bigger? Susie gaped at him, horrified. But that's worse. How big's the house now? It must take up half the street. What sort of a fly-by-night merchant do you take me for? Said Fletch. You didn't make the outside any bigger, and I haven't touched any of the other rooms. What would be the point in that? Wait a minute. Susie fought to digest this new information. You mean the house is still its normal size, even though you made the hall bigger than the house? That's right, said Fletch, grinning, warming to his topic. It's pretty standard stuff, really. Your basic meta-dimensional engineering, a dash of magic, and a few bits of double-sided sticky tape. Job done. Susie looked again at the living room doorway. She could still see her parents beyond it, fast asleep and normal-sized. But the doorway itself seemed to flicker and stretch when she focused on it. It only took her a few seconds to realise that she was seeing it as both sizes at the same time. But by then it started to make her feel seasick, and she had to look away. No, she said, shaking her head. I'm sorry, but that's impossible. Is it? Said Fletch, feigning surprise. You can't just make something bigger on the inside than the outside. Of course you can. It's simple physics. Susie frowned. You mean physics? No, said Fletch. Physics. Like physics, only fuzzier. Physics can't be fuzzy, said Susie, indignant that something so precious to her should be treated like a bit of a joke. It's either right or wrong. It won't let you break the rules. That's why physics kind of saunters past them, said Fletch. It's easier than doing anything by the book. He gave her an infuriating grin, and she was drawing breath to argue her case further when Stonker cleared his throat. This is all jolly nice, he said, twirling the end of his moustache around his fingers, but I'm afraid we really must be leaving. We're already late and I want to get underway before... Mr. Stonker! Mr. Stonker! The voice came from the direction of the carriages. Too late, sighed Stonker, pinching the bridge of his enormous nose. Here he comes. The train's locomotive pulled a tender behind it, which was like a large oblong skip on wheels. Susie assumed it must be full of coal or whatever fuel the locomotive burned. Behind them there were two carriages. The first was big, bulky and cylindrical, like an armoured petrol tanker, but with a row of small portholes in the side and a knot of tubes and chimneys sprouting from the top. The letters HEC were stencilled down the side in large white script. The carriage at the rear was smaller and looked like an antique goods carriage, the red paint peeling from its wooden panels. It was from this rear coach that another troll had emerged, and he was now hurrying towards them, waving frantically. He looked quite different from both Stonker and Fletch. His arms were long and bent in strange directions, and he seemed to have no legs at all, just a pair of large feet attached directly to his body. Only when he tripped over and landed flat on his face did Susie realise why he looked so strange. He was wearing a uniform that was several sizes too big for him. Aren't either of you going to help him? She asked as the new arrival floundered in a confusion of sleeves and coattails, trying to get back on his feet. I suppose we ought to, said Stonker from the gangway above them. Fletch, be a good chap and help the postmaster up, would you? Not in my job description, muttered Fletch. Why don't you do it? Because I'm all the way up here, Stonker said. Besides, I helped him up last time. Susie shook her head and hurried over to the flailing bundle of clothes. It was hard to tell which bit of the troll was which, so she just reached out, hauled him up, and deposited him on what she hoped were his feet. His uniform wasn't the same as Stonker's, she saw. It was red instead of blue, and it looked older, more ornate. A tarnished gold medal dangled from the chest, and an old-fashioned horn or bugle was embroidered in one of the shoulders, although the thread was badly frayed. The bundle shook itself, and another huge nose, followed by small, wide eyes, poked out from above the collar of the coat. This troll's skin was a pale light lichen green, and hardly wrinkled at all. Susie guessed he was much younger. Thank you, said the troll, and then, oh no, a human! He leapt in the air in fright, but his feet were already moving by the time he touched down, and he took off like a bullet, swerving around Susie and heading for Fletch and Stonker, where he promptly tripped over the hem of his coat and went sprawling once again. It's all right, postmaster, called Stonker. We think she's harmless. The fallen troll said nothing in response, but his words were muffled said something in response, but his words were muffled by several layers of cloth. Neither of the others made a move to help him, so, with a weary sigh, Susie retraced her steps and set him back on his feet. He shrugged the uniform away from his face and gave her a suspicious look. "Are you sure, Mr. Stonker? She looks like she might bite." "I promise I won't," said Susie. "She'd have to chew her way through all that uniform first, Wilmot," said Fletch. "You know they come in smaller sizes, right?" The postmaster sniffed and turned his nose up. "I've told you before, Fletch, this was my father's uniform, and his father's before him. I have a legacy to uphold." "The legacy needs longer legs, boy," said Fletch with a sly grin. Wilmot flared his nostrils in response. "What exactly did you want, postmaster?" said Stonker. "As you can see, we are a trifle busy." "I came to see what was causing the delay," said Wilmot. "Our next customer is waiting for us." "I'm aware of that," said Stonker. "And I can't just leave the package on her doorstep and run," Wilmot went on, jiggling from foot to foot inside his uniform. "It needs to be signed for. I don't want to be the one who rings her doorbell if we're late." "We'll get there as quickly as possible," said Stonker. "I'm just waiting for— Aha! Here we are." Yet another figure had emerged from the driver's cab and was ambling along the gangway. Susie could tell immediately that it was not like the others. It was bigger than she was and loped along on all fours. It wore faded blue overalls but was otherwise covered from top to toe in vivid yellow fur. Only when it came to a halt beside Stonker and reared up onto his hind leg did Susie realise what she was looking at. "Is that a bear?" she exclaimed. The creature spared her a curious glance. "A brown bear, to be precise," said Stonker. "Ursus arctos. A bit of a departure for a troll train, I'll admit, but she scored top marks on her entrance exams. Ursel here keeps the firebox stoked and the wheels turning." "How are we looking, Ursel?" said Stonker. "Gruff," said the bear, in a voice so deep that Susie felt it shiver in her bones. "Jolly good, then. Well, stand by the valves and be ready to give it plenty of welly. I want to get out of here before anything else goes wrong. Rum." With a last glance down at the assembled audience, Ursel turned and loped back towards the cab. Susie felt the question well up in her throat before she had time to stop it. If it's a brown bear, why is it bright yellow? Everything stopped. Stonker and Wilmot stared at her, looking mortified, and even the train seemed to have quietened its hissing and clanking. Fletch winced. Then, very slowly, all eyes turned to Ursel. Susie clapped her hands over her mouth as though she could stuff the question back inside. She could tell from everyone's reactions that it had been the wrong thing to say. But it shouldn't have been. This whole stupid situation, trolls and bears and trains, just all of it, was starting to upset her. Because while she would never have admitted it, she had always been secretly proud of her ability to understand the nuts and bolts of reality. Now, though, it felt as if that reality was tilting underneath her, threatening to throw her off. She just wanted it to make sense again. Ursel turned and padded back towards them, dark eyes fixed on Susie, who was now too terrified to move. "It's going to eat me," she thought. "Eaten by a bear in my own house." But the thought that made her saddest was this: now I'll never get to understand what's happening. Ursel reared up, leaning over the railing. A string of saliva hung from a large insider. "Gross!" Ursel grunted. Susie stood to polite attention, not daring to take her eyes off those fangs. "What did it say?" she said, with a pleading look towards Stonker. He gave a knowing smile, and his eyes twinkled again. "She said she's not an it, she's a she, thank you very much. and it's none of your business if she happens to prefer being blonde. Susie looked again at Ursel with a mixture of shock and relief. Do you mean you're a girl? This was met with a guttural roar that made everyone jump back. What? Said Susie, trembling with shock. What did I do wrong this time? It's a common mistake, said Stonker, rubbing his ringing ears. She prefers the term woman, something to do with being a responsible adult who pays her taxes. Ursel flecked her shoulders and gave a decisive nod, before turning and lumbering back towards the cab. Susie wasn't sure if it was possible for bears to wink, but she was sure Ursel gave her one as she went. A few seconds later, steam hissed from between the driving wheels. The boiler rattled and the whole train lurched forward a few centimetres, straining against the brakes. Wilmot turned and dashed back towards the rear coach, his coat-tails flapping behind him. I'm sorry there's no time for more pleasantries, Stonker called out over the rising noise. I'll leave you in Fletcher's capable hands. Fletch grunted. But I still don't understand what all this means, Susie protested. Where did it all come from? Where are you going? Stonker drew himself up and puffed out his chest, as a proud little smile crept onto his face. From Trollville to the 5 corners of reality, my dear. No package too big, no postcard too small. Come rain, shine, or meteor shower, the impossible postal express will deliver. He whipped off his cap and gave a theatrical bow as the locomotive strained forward again, the carriages rattling behind it. Farewell, he called, steadying himself against the handrail, and try not to worry. Fletch really is jolly skilled. He turned and hurried back along the gangway to the cab, slamming the door shut behind him. A second later, the brakes unlocked with an almighty clunk, and the huge driving wheels ground slowly forwards. I suppose we better get on with it, said Fletch, cracking his knuckles. He reached out to his tool bag and paused. Where is it? Susie had no idea what he was talking about, but some nervous instinct told her to start backing away as the train lumbered into motion beside them. I can't do the job without it, said Fletch. He patted his pockets and looked around in confusion. Then his head snapped up and his eyes fixed on Susie. You, he exclaimed. You took it from me. Susie broke into a backwards trot as Fletch advanced on her. What? You said you'd give it back. Where is it? Before Susie could answer, she stepped on something hard and narrow, which rolled out from under her, taking her foot with it. She felt a moment of weightlessness before she landed flat on her back. She sat up, nursing her head with one hand, and looked round to see what she had stepped on. It was Fletch's metal rod. She must have dropped it when she threw herself to clear the train. She saw it at the same instant. He saw it at the same instant she did, and pounced for it. He was fast, but she was faster. She snatched it up and sprang back. Give it back, he shouted. No, she said. Whatever it is you need to do this confusion spell on me, you just said so. Fletch crept towards her, his hands up as though she was pointing a gun at him. I know how to use it properly. You don't. I don't want to use it, she said, and I don't want you to either. The engine slid through the archway and was swallowed by the darkness. The huffing of its chimney, the clank of its wheels, the hiss and gush of its steam echoed back out of the darkness as it continued to gather speed. Susie felt a sudden tug, a fear that something very important was right in front of her but was slipping away. Are there really 5 corners of reality? She asked. Fletch stopped, surprised. Of course there are. Don't they teach you anything useful at school? The tender slipped through the tunnel mouth and out of sight. Now give back what's not yours. He started forward again. Susie didn't realise she had made up her mind until she started running. Not away from Fletch, but towards him. She saw the startled look on his face as he spread his arms wide to catch her, but she was too quick. She heard his little yelp of shock as she rushed past him and felt the slight tug of her dressing gown as he tried to snatch at her. She was running level with the train now, but it was still gathering speed and steadily outpacing her. The tug of anxiety felt stronger, but clear as well. The world made no sense anymore because of this train and the things that were on it. If she ever wanted to understand it again, she couldn't afford to let the train go without her. If she did, they would make her forget she'd ever seen it, and she'd live out the rest of her life in blissful ignorance, never knowing any better. And that scared her. That scared her so badly that she put her head down and carried on, with her heartbeat in her throat. The strange cylindrical tanker that bore the letters HEC entered the tunnel, leaving only the old red coach at the rear. It was close enough to touch, but the tunnel mouth was fast approaching, and she was running out of ground. She had no idea what would happen to her if she ran into the tunnel, and she wasn't keen to find out. "Stop!" bellowed Fletch. The carriage slid past her, the leading wheels vanishing over the threshold. The door through which Wilmot had disappeared inside was gaining on her fast. Last chance. She put on a final burst of speed, swerved towards the coach, and jumped. Her hand closed around the coach's door handle in the same second the world around her went dark. The deep echoes of the hall were swept away by the noisy rush of the tunnel. Cold wind tugged at her hair and clothes, and she planted her feet as securely as she could on the narrow metal step below the door. Looking back, she was just in time to see the tunnel mouth shrinking away into the distance. Framed inside it was the tiny figure of Fletch, standing in the hallway, shaking his fist in anger.